Welcome to Hands-On Biology. We are diving into sexual reproduction in plants. This is a biological process in which offspring are produced by the fusion of male and female gametes, sex cells. It involves genetic recombination, resulting in offspring that are genetically different from their parents. In higher plants, the reproductive organ is the flower. A flower is the reproductive organ in a plant. It is made of several parts. 4 are major. The gynoecium is made of carpels. It is made up of the ovary that contains the female gametes, the stigma that receives the pollen grains, and the style for the movement of the male gametes to the ovary. It has the androecium, the male part of the flower. The androecium is a collection of stamens. A stamen is made up of the anther head, which forms the pollen grains and the filament. The outermost floral whorl is the calyx, which is made of sepals. The second whorl is the corolla, made up of petals. They are brightly colored in insect-pollinated flowers.
Welcome to Hands-On Biology, competency-based learning. Struggling with biology? Not anymore. Here, we break down complex biology concepts into simple, clear, and engaging lessons. Hit that subscribe button now and take your learning to the next level.
Structure of the male gamete, pollen grain. The outermost structure is the exine, the intine that protects the two nuclei. The first is the nucleus, is the pollen tube nucleus. This forms the pollen tube for the movement of the male gametes, and the generative nucleus. This divides by mitosis to form two male nuclei, the first male nucleus and the second male nucleus. These two fertilize the contents of the ovule within the ovary in a process known as double fertilization. The structure of the female gamete in a flower, the ovule, within it is the embryo sac. It is made up of the micropyle for the passage of the pollen tube. The outermost integuments for protection. The embryo sac houses numerous components. Near the micropyle is the egg cell and the two synergids, the two polar nuclei at the center, and the antipodal cells at the chalaza end. During double fertilization, the two male nuclei fuse the egg cell and the two polar nuclei respectively. Pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. There are two types of pollination. Self-pollination. This is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or between two flowers on the same plant. Cross-pollination. This is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower on a different plant, but of the same species. Advantages of cross-pollination. Increased genetic diversity. Promotes genetic variation, which enhances the plant's ability to adapt to changing environments and resist diseases. Hybrid vigor. It can result in hybrid offspring with superior qualities, such as increased growth rate or better resistance to pests. Reduced risk of harmful mutations. Genetic diversity decreases the likelihood of harmful mutations being passed on to offspring. Evolutionary flexibility. Enhances the species' ability to evolve and survive in diverse environments. Share the video and leave a comment. A. Disadvantages. Dependence on pollinators. Requires the presence of pollinators, which can be unreliable or scarce in certain environments. Resource intensive. Plants may need to invest more energy in attracting pollinators through nectar production, scent, or large, colorful flowers. Risk of pollen waste. There is a risk that pollen may not reach another flower, resulting in wasted reproductive effort. Potential hybridization issues. Cross-pollination with other species can sometimes lead to undesirable traits or hybrid offspring less suited to the environment. Advantages of self-pollination. Consistency in traits. It ensures the preservation of desirable traits within the plant, leading to uniform offspring. Less dependency. These plants do not rely on external pollinators, making them more resilient in environments where pollinators are scarce. Resource efficiency. Less energy is spent attracting pollinators, such as producing nectar or large, colorful flowers. Guaranteed reproduction. Ensures that the plant can reproduce even in isolated or adverse conditions. Disadvantages. Reduced genetic diversity. limits genetic variation, which can make the species more susceptible to diseases and environmental changes. Propagation of defects. Harmful mutations or undesirable traits are more likely to be passed on to the offspring. Adaptation. Limitations. Less ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions due to the lack of genetic variation. Agents of pollination. These are things that aid the process of pollination. The agents of pollination include animals, water, wind, and artificial pollination. There are, however, two major agents, that is, wind and insects. Pollination can therefore be described as wind pollination and insect pollination. Subscribe and share the video now. Characteristics of insect-pollinated flowers. They have brightly colored petals to attract insects. They have a scent to attract insects. They have large, conspicuous petals, which are landing sites for insects. They have sticky pollen grains, which stick to the insect body. They have sticky stigmas, which hold pollen grains. They produce a few sticky pollen grains. They produce heavy pollen grains. They produce nectar from nectaries to attract insects. Subscribe now and share the video. Characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers. They have dull petals. They have small petals. They produce light pollen grains, which can easily be carried by wind. They do not produce nectar. They have feathery stigmas to trap pollen grains carried by wind. They produce a lot of pollen grains. They have no scent. They have long stamens and pistils hanging outside the petals to release and receive respectively pollen grains easily. When mature pollen grains land on a mature stigma, the sucrose solution produced by the stigma causes the pollen grain to germinate. The pollen grain produces a pollen tube, which grows down the style to the ovary. The pollen tube nucleus, which controls the development of the pollen tube. The pollen tube is attracted by the chemicals secreted by the ovary, and it is therefore positively chemotropic. It is also negatively aerotropic because it grows away from the air. The generative nucleus moves behind the pollen tube nucleus. The generative nucleus divides by mitosis to produce two male nuclei. When the pollen tube reaches the ovule, it enters the embryo sac through the micropyle. The tip of the pollen tube ruptures and the two male nuclei are released into the embryo sac. One of the male nuclei fuses with the egg cell ovum to produce a diploid zygote, while the other male nucleus fuses with the polar nucleus to form a triploid endosperm nucleus, which later develops into the endosperm. This is known as double fertilization, and it occurs in higher plants only. Thank you for watching.
Gain access to our well-illustrated notes, activities of integration, assessments and quizzes, and exciting project work.